Okay, I'm calling the November 20th, 2023 meeting of the East Lyme Ad Hoc Committee on Short-Term Rentals to order, and we'll say the Pledge of Allegiance. Anyone want to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance this evening? Raise your hand. Somebody? Okay. I'll call on Mr. Zamarka then.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, Mark. Okay. Next item on the agenda is public delegations, where the public can make some commentary on any item that is on the agenda. I just ask you to keep your remarks to 3 minutes. I think that's pretty reasonable, and that's been our standard so far, roughly. I think
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, so who wants to volunteer to time, just in case?
Oh, okay. I got to do something as co-chair.
Right, okay. All right, thank you, Gary. Okay, anybody from the public would like to get up and say anything? Okay, that was quick. Okay, very good, so no timing needed. Okay, our next item is approval of minutes. The minutes of our last meeting, which were October 23rd, 2023. So do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
Yeah, motion to approve.
Okay, and do I have a second for that motion?
Second.
Okay, so Gary for motioning and seconding. Okay, any comment, any correction, concern about the minutes?
No corrections.
They're very thorough. Thank you.
Right, yeah, they are.
Very good.
No repetitions this time.
Right, it's okay. The computer cooperated. That's great. Okay, so seeing none, I will take a vote. All those in favor of approving those minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, motion carries 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6-0. Okay, great. Next item on the agenda is an update from Attorney Zamarka. Thanks, Mark.
Good evening, folks. I'm Mark Zamarka with the Town Attorney's Office. There's not really much to update per se, although there is one administrative matter. As we all know, there was a municipal election last week, and some members who are on this committee are no longer serving on the boards or commissions that they previously were. According to the charge issued by the Board of Selectmen, there is one representative from zoning, Ms. Thurlow, and one representative from the Board of Selectmen, Ms. Santoro. Since those seats were not won in the general election, it will be up to the Board of Selectmen to decide whether or not to allow Ms. Thurlow and Ms. Santoro to continue, or whether they decide to fill new spots. That will be at the next Board of Selectmen meeting, just so we know going forward. The good thing is we have a co-chair, Mr. Cichello, so we will at least have some continuity in the event that there are some changes made. In terms of an update, I think it might be a good idea to sort of revisit or get a refresher on the case that's currently pending in the Supreme Court, Wibby versus Pine Orchard Zoning Board of Appeals. That, as we know, is the matter of first impression in the state of Connecticut regarding, in a large sense, the legality of short-term rentals. As a reminder, the Pine Orchard Association is a section within the town of Branford. It's a quasi-municipality that does have its own zoning, somewhat similar to the beach communities we have here. In 2019, the zoning enforcement officer issued a cease and desist to the plaintiff, Mr. Wibby, for violating the then in effect 1994 zoning regulations for essentially running a business, i.e. a short-term rental in an area that was zoned for single-family dwelling use. In 2018, the association amended its regulations, to prohibit short-term rentals, but because this use existed prior to that, it was the 1994 regulations that were operable. Mr. Wibby appealed that cease and desist to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and the ZBA upheld the cease and desist. Mr. Wibby then took an appeal to the Superior Court. The Superior Court reversed the cease and desist order. They held that Mr. Wibby was entitled to use the short-term rental as a pre-existing non-conforming use because they were lawful under the regulations prior to the 2018 amendments. And more specifically, the trial court found that nothing in the 1994 regulations precluded short-term rentals. It's interesting to note that, as most towns and municipalities in Connecticut do, the Pine Orchard Association had what's known as permissive zoning, which means, broadly speaking, if a use is not specifically provided for in the zoning regulations, it is not allowed. This is to prevent literally uses happening by accident. If it's there, it's allowed. If it's not, it's not. The ZBA then appealed that to the appellate court. And in sum, the trial court found that the 1994 regulations, the one in effect, they were clear and unambiguous. They did not prohibit short-term rentals. The appellate court then affirmed that decision in part and reversed it in part. The part that was reversed isn't really germane to what we're doing, but what they did was they held that the 1994 regulations did permit the use of single-family dwellings as short-term rentals. We've discussed this before, but they made some interesting points. First off, they found that there was no requirement under the regulations that a single-family dwelling need be owner-occupied. They also, and this is something we've brought up a few times, noted that there is an indisputable right of an owner to do with his property as he wishes within the bounds of the law. And there are three things that essentially go along with that right of ownership: the right to live in, sell, or rent the property as one sees fit. And the court held that stripping an owner of any of those three rights, in this case the right to rent the property, is a significant restriction on that ownership. And the appellate court agreed with the trial court, found that since the 1994 regulations did not impose a minimum length of occupancy, the appellate court was not going to do so. They also analyzed the regulations at length and concluded that when the association enacted the regulations in 1994, they knew what they were doing, to the point that if they had not wanted to allow rentals of a certain duration, they knew how to do so, but they chose not to. The appellate court also noted that, and this is where we get somewhat into some of the regulations, some of the similarities we have with the regulations here in East Lyme. The appellate court noted that the regulations at issue in Pine Orchard allowed owners to advertise their properties for rent. And that was a recognition by the town through its zoning commission that rentals of property of single-family residences were allowed. Since there was not any temporal or duration limit on those rentals, the court was not going to impose one. And again, the sign regulation at issue in Pine Orchard is somewhat similar to the one we have here. So again, this is why we're sort of waiting to see what happens at the Supreme Court. So in essence, what the appellate court held was that that the short-term rental of a single-family dwelling was permissible, that the regulations contemplated rentals of single-family units and imposed no minimum length. So as long as the property was being occupied by a single family for living purposes, that use was permitted. Now, as you can imagine, the ZBA petitioned for Supreme Court review. That was granted in May. The review before the Supreme Court is limited to one issue. Did the appellate court correctly decide that short-term rentals of single-family dwellings was a permissible use under the 1994 zoning regulations? That is the only issue, at least in theory, based on the certification that was granted by the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court will hear. Now, that was granted in May of 2023. The ZBA filed their brief in August. The plaintiff, Mr. Wibby, filed his brief in October, and a reply brief was just recently filed by the ZBA, as well as a couple of abutters who are joint appellants. Given that, argument will probably happen sometime early next year. probably February, March, something like that. In light of that, that will tell us a lot in terms of when, how, and if we would proceed. Again, this commission is advisory. You can take no action other than to recommend to the Board of Selectmen potential courses of action or no course of action at all. I leave it up to the committee as to whether or not you feel it's prudent to wait for the outcome of the Supreme Court case. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Any questions?
Yes.
Sure.
Go ahead, Gary.
So, the only thing that the Supreme Court will decide on is whether or not a town can prohibit short-term rentals completely?
Well, what courts on appeal try to do things on as narrow an issue as possible. If they can decide an appeal that has 10 questions based on one that they feel is dispositive, they won't touch the other 9. Here, the only question that the Supreme Court has asked for briefs on is whether or not the use of single-family dwellings as short-term rentals were permissible under the regulations in Pine Orchard. That's it. Now, clearly that will have a lot more application outside of just Pine Orchard, but that is the issue that the court is going to consider.
Okay, thank you.
So if I may, you suggested that Pine Orchard had revised their regulations subsequent to 1994.
They had, but all parties and the court agreed that the 1994 regulations were the ones that applied to this matter.
To this matter, but other people in Pine Orchard are governed by the later regulations?
They were enacted in 2018, and they specifically prohibit short-term rentals. I know of nothing that has been challenged from that since.
So,
But they do not when enacted, zoning regulations apply prospectively. They don't apply retroactively.
right, so if people were doing short-term rentals before that,
Well, that's another issue, and the other issue that the appellate court, again, it's not really germane to what we're dealing with here, but the other issue before the appellate court was whether or not Mr. Wibby had established a valid non-conforming pre-existing use. The appellate court remanded that back to the ZBA to make a determination on that. Apparently, they felt there wasn't enough enough of a factual basis to make a decision on that.
So, if the Supreme Court upholds short-term rentals based on the 1994 agreement, that does not negate the 2018 zoning?
The 2018 amendments are not before the court,
Okay, so those remain valid?
unless and until challenged.
Okay.
Good question. Basically, there's a very nice explanation, Mark, in but correct me if I'm wrong, what the Supreme Court then is basically saying is that since they didn't address in 1994 short-term rentals, and so that's what's being challenged, right? Because they're saying since it wasn't addressed, it's not allowed. The town is saying it's not allowed because it wasn't addressed in 94.
Yes, that is one
Okay.
of the
So
positions
really,
the town takes. Yes,
From our
or the association. Yes.
right, from our perspective, I assume our zoning regulations do not address that going back. Is that
They do not.
okay? So from that point of view, that will affect us in that particular decision. But so we could obviously make a decision going forward, and everybody else would technically, assuming it comes down, the Supreme Court rules that it did not apply, then everybody's grandfathered in effectively.
Well, again,
Or
I would not even try
Try
to
to go there.
speculate on
Okay.
what might happen.
Well, that's true.
On that.
So-
I
so-
simply would not.
But from this, from the point of view of what they're simply deciding, and really it's not just for short-term rentals, it's anything that is not in those regulations, is that, like you'd mentioned what that fancy word was before with the zoning, being, if it was said or not said.
permissive zoning.
Permissive zoning.
Permissive zoning.
Right, right. That's what they're basically addressing, because it could be short-term rentals, it could be X,
Well,
Y,
it's a little more involved than that.
Is it?
That is one of the positions the town has taken. The appellate court held that because one of the bases for the appellate court opinion was that because rentals of single-family dwellings were allowed and there was no durational limit put on that, then you could not distinguish between a short-term and a long-term rental. There was no basis to do so, and the appellate court was not going to impose that kind of durational limit.
The next question I would have is, does a, I don't want to use the word opinion because you're a lawyer, obviously, and I know you wouldn't be able to, obviously give us a legal opinion on this, but the question I would have when they say short, single family living, I would think that there's a definitional difference between single family living and transient living. For example, a hotel where somebody's coming in, they're not really, I wouldn't say they're really living in a hotel, they're staying and they're leaving. That's why I see a definition, I see a difference.
That is one of the arguments that the association is putting forward on appeal, yes.
Okay.
Mark, could you go back a bit about signage and rental signage and how that may impact this decision going forward, and then how it might impact the applicability of that Supreme Court decision for us, and
Well,
where specifically in our regulations is this appearing?
I don't have the specific site for us. I believe it's section. Oh gosh, I wouldn't even hazard a guess. But in general, any municipality's zoning regulations, the largest portion of that is signage.
Okay.
East Lyme allows advertising of properties for rent via signs. The Pine Orchard Association had a very similar sign regulation in their zoning regulations. Mm-hmm. One of the avenues of analysis by the appellate court was that, okay, the association allows you to advertise homes for rent. Therefore, the association knew through their zoning commission and the adoption of their zoning regulations, they acknowledged that these properties can be rented. However, they put no time frame on how long those properties could be rented. Because of that, the appellate court was not willing to do so either. Again, probably in large part because of the important right that they found of a homeowner to either sell, live in, or rent their property.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So emphasis more on the time frame, maybe not so much on the ability to have the STRs in the first place. Am I wrong on that, or I don't know?
Again, I wouldn't try to ascribe reason to what the appellate court did. All I can tell you is that what they said, one of the bases of their opinion was the fact that because renting properties was allowed, and it was a little bit of a roundabout going through the sign regulations, but they did decide that the association acknowledged that properties could be rented. In light of that, they were not going to move forward and put some kind of duration on it.
So they really didn't address it then. They didn't address the time, whether it be one night or annually. They just said, we're not going there.
They said that since rentals are allowed, they were not going to put a time frame on it.
Correct, so they didn't address it then. Okay.
I leave that up to you as to how you want to interpret it, Mr.
Well, I saw
Sullivan.
it interpret that, yeah.
I mean, they kind of did address it. They addressed the fact that the town regulation failed to address it.
Sure.
And the court just didn't want to, from what I remember, didn't want to be the one to say 7 days. There was no basis to say seven. Any time.
There was one of the things the court said was there was no basis to decide between 3 days, 7 days, and 7 months. Is what it comes down to. Okay. Thank
Any
you.
other questions for Mark?
Nope. Anything else?
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, and we'll keep what Mark has told us as a kind of backdrop for our discussion tonight going on. Okay, so that brings us to item 5 on the agenda, which is continued discussion and possible action concerning our findings so far, our goals, and ways to address any concerns. So 5A is Gary summarizing his chart of findings.
I just have a little, I didn't make a chart, I did bullet, it wasn't
That's
enough
fine.
information.
That's fine.
What? No chart?
No, that's all right, as long as we have it consolidated.
Still one less thing to be thankful for.
Right. And look, folks, it's not 50 pages long, so it's there.
Usually.
All right, so we had a lot of input from residents, investors, people who wanted to make comments at the public hearing, who sent us emails. And it was a lot of stuff, so it was about time to kind of synthesize all of that information and see what were the main issues that people were talking about. So I kind of broke it down into two different documents. One is East Lyme short-term rental owners' arguments in favor of short-term rentals. And I have another document, East Lyme residents' arguments against short-term rentals. The short-term rental owners document is much larger because as I was going through the information, there were just many more short-term rental owners who have participated in this process. So let me see what I did there. So basically, the arguments, kind of the main arguments that I saw in the comments was that short-term rental income is important to help defray the cost of owning property. Beach properties, they're complaining about expensive taxes, insurance, maintenance, improvements. And their short-term rental income was important to help people pay for these things, which is a legitimate argument. We had other owners, so those were kind of the investor type people. We had other people who inherited property, and they indicated that, hey, look, my parents may have been able to afford it, but now it's gone through the family and there's several owners, so trying to keep these properties in the family, we need these short-term rental incomes to do that. And then we had investors not living in East Lyme coming in saying, hey, we want to buy a home, we want to invest in this, and we cannot afford to maintain them without renting them as a short-term rental. So that was kind of how income from short-term rental benefits the homeowners. Another argument, second argument that we had that a few people made were that property owners have a right to do what they want with their property. One individual indicated that property rights are sacred. So if we want to rent our homes for a particular length of time, whether it be a month, a year, 7 days, or 1 day, we should be allowed to do that. And neither our neighbors nor the town should dictate to us what we should do, what we can do with our property. So this is the property right argument. Leave me alone, this is my property, I can do what I want with it. A third argument that people voice in favor of short-term rentals is that there's a benefit to the town of East Lyme. Short-term rental, and many people were talking about the benefits to the town. Short-term rental guests spend a lot of money in our local businesses. They add diversity to the town, the guests do. They promote tourism, which brings money into the town. They indicated that too much regulations of short-term rentals will move tourist dollars to neighboring towns which are more friendly to short-term rentals. And they indicated that short-term rental income allows owners to improve their properties, which improves the aesthetics of the neighborhood. So those were the general benefits that the people who commented talked about. They also talked about the fourth benefit was the benefit to the state. Short-term rental owners pay taxes to the state. The fifth argument that people in favor of short-term rentals was talking about was the history of renting beach properties in East Lyme. East Lyme has a long history of renting property in East Lyme. We're a beach community, and that's what we do. It's been going on for many longer than my life, many decades. So that's a legitimate argument. Not that I'm the arbiter of what's legitimate. The sixth argument was that, and this is, less people talked about these, that short-term rentals are better for property owners than long-term rentals. Some of the people were saying that several people said short-term rental guests are better than long-term rental guests. They cause less damage, they cause less disruption. If you don't like them, and if they are disruptive, at the end of the week they're gone. Whereas with a troublesome long-term renter, then these folks, they cause a lot of damage to the property. It's very expensive to repair them. It's a long eviction process. So, hence the argument, short-term rental guests are better. One other argument, a couple people made this argument, was short-term guests are better than traditional neighbors. I guess this goes into the same realm. You can have a bad neighbor, he's going to be there for the rest of your life, and you have to deal with this person, whereas a bad short-term rental guest, they're gone in a short period of time. The eighth argument that people in favor of short-term rentals put forth was that short-term rentals provide a valuable travel service to travelers other than to tourists. And many people talked about these. Short-term rental guests were coming in for weddings, they were coming in for graduations, they were visiting nurses, they were just people coming in for short weekend, long weekend events. And this short-term rental provides an authentic atmosphere for people to come into rather than just go to a local hotel. A couple of people made this ninth argument. The short-term rentals do not add children to the schools, and the town saves money by having less children in the schools. It's an argument, it's low on the list, but it's an argument. Number 10, the 10th argument that I found in here was that this committee should be the one in charge of making recommendations because we are spending our time, we're researching things, we're listening to people's opinions, and that we should not have a town-wide referendum because voters are uninformed. So that was another argument. Now, what I did, just for the sake of discussion, I came up with some sample counter-arguments to these things. So, things can be said, but for the sake of argument, these are not my positions, for the sake of argument, we need to kind of have a discussion. These pro-arguments, some of them are fine, and some of them, you probably agree, have some holes in them. For example, the first one, short-term rental money income helps defray the cost of owning property. The argument against that is that short-term rentals reduce affordable housing in town. So they make it more expensive for people to come into town and find properties that they can afford to live in and raise their families. So that's a counter-argument. And again, these are for sake of argument, not my positions. investors say that they need short-term rental income in order to afford it. An argument against that is, don't buy it if you can't afford it. You can still rent it for a year. You can still rent it for 6 months, a month, weekly. It seems like people were having problems with these 3 and 4 day rentals. So an argument is, if you say you can't afford it, then just go buy something that you can afford as an investor. And don't break the law, because it's not allowed in East Lyme. Don't break the law and say, oh, I need to do short-term rentals in order to afford it. Just an argument, counter-argument. Another counter-argument is, investors really shouldn't make that argument because you're creating your own financial problem. You can't come in and say, hey, I just bought a $2 million house and I need to charge $1,000 a night at an Airbnb in order to afford this. And if I can't afford it, then I'm going to lose the house. Well, you made a poor business decision in doing that. And why should the residents of East Lyme, and particularly the neighbors of these investors who made poor decisions, have to suffer the consequences of bad short-term rental guests? Again, it's an argument. So those are some counter-arguments for that. Now, counter-arguments for property rights are sacred. No right in this country is absolute. Courts have said that there are a bundle of rights, and you heard the council talk about them: renting, owning, and selling. So courts indicate that we have already infringed upon property rights with zoning laws. So zoning laws are already an infringement on your right to do things. So the mere fact that people can't rent them for 3 days or 7 days does not necessarily infringe upon your right to rent a property. Courts have said you can still rent them for long periods of time. So you still have those bundle of rights. We're not removing those bundle of rights. We may be restricting them under police powers of zoning, but we're not eliminating it. And again, these are not my positions. These are just arguments for discussion. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay.
That's okay. It's good to show you.
Right. The argument that short-term rentals benefit the town. And these arguments are so we can have a discussion of these. Because if we don't talk about the counter-arguments, then it's really having a disingenuous discussion of this whole issue. We have to flush it out so people can make informed decisions. We can't just put our head in the sand and not talk about these uncomfortable things. So short-term rentals benefit the town. They don't benefit the town if we lose affordable housing. They don't benefit the town if we have over-tourism, like people and we can look all over the world, but we can look to Mystic. People in Mystic are complaining. Some complain, some love it. We can look all over the world. Many, many cities all over the world there's so much over-tourism. I mean, we are not Venice. We are not Florence. We're at least Lyme. But we do have to look to the future. We have to look 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road. And, we have New York Times saying we're a great little town. That may be helpful. That may be detrimental to our town. So some people may argue that the future, there may be over-tourism. Now, an argument is that short-term rentals owners are ignoring zoning laws. And that can lead to other people ignoring other zoning laws or other laws and ordinances in town. Another counter-argument is that we are losing the character of our town. I think it was in today's paper or yesterday's paper. They were saying, oh, how lovely East Lyme is and whatnot, and these big yellow buildings are not as beautiful as people think they are, and that we're losing the small town character of our town. Because these little beach communities, the little I know about them, they seem like little communities as opposed to just big rental places like the Outer Banks, that type of thing. They were kind of spread out and they're made for renting. So the loss of character. Another issue that came up was diversity. So we can argue, or it can be argued, that diversity of East Lyme it can be reduced because properties are being taken off the market because they're being used as short-term rentals. And then, lastly, the effect on neighbors. Neighbors have a right to have peaceful enjoyment of their property also. So we have to balance neighbors' rights with the property rights of people and their right to rent property. The argument, well, we have a history of renting beach properties. That's true. It seems like the town doesn't really talk about, it's kind of unregulated as to how long the minimal rental is. But short-term rentals are really not allowed from what I'm hearing again. So we have to balance the history of renting with the violation of the law.
What do you guys do? 7 days. Really? Anybody enforce that?
Right. So those are some counter-arguments. To the arguments in favor of STRs. Now, in reviewing all of the material, short-term rental owners had recommendations regarding how do we coexist with each other. How do short-term rental owners and neighbors coexist? Some people said that there's no evidence that short-term rentals are a problem in East Lyme. Some people said that not all short-term rental properties are party houses. Another argument was that do not punish all short-term rental owners because of a few bad apples, because of the few party houses. The party houses seem to be the issue that many people were complaining about. Some people wanted no limits on short-term rental. It's our right to do what we want. We want no limits. Some people said that more rules and regulations cause an enforcement problem and they cost the town money. And some other people said there's no difference between a 7-day rental and a rental that's less than 7 days. So short-term rental owners suggested that they post, and we heard a lot about from the owners, and I think the owners who came to the meetings and who have sent emails to us, it doesn't sound, in my view, that those folks were the problem. They came in and were very conscientious. We want to be 5-star owners. We want 5-star guests. And you came in with so many things that you do to ensure that you do that. And based upon what the police chief said, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of problems that he's aware of. So it sounds like the people who came and spoke, and the people who sent emails, none of those folks were the bad apples. I don't think the bad apples have participated. So short-term rental owners have put in a lot of good ideas on how to run your properties well. And one person said that short-term owners should regulate their own industry. And again, some of the regulations that were suggested, or that were addressed, were parking problems was a big one due to narrow streets, noise ordinances. A big one was the number of occupants. Many times there were many complaints that there were too many occupants for a particular house, maybe a 3-bedroom house, and 15 people were sleeping in the house. And with that comes more cars and more parking trouble. So those were issues. Some of the people recommended limiting the time of rental to no less than 1 week. So even some short-term rental owners voiced their position that, maybe we just compromise and keep it 1 week as a minimum. Some people said, please don't ban them altogether. I didn't see any recommendations from any of there may have been one person who said a moratorium, but I did not hear anyone suggest that there should be a ban. I did not see that information in any of our notes. Everyone talked about registration. A couple people talked about to prevent crime, short-term owner should reside in the property, so owner-occupied. There wasn't many for that, in support of that. Trash was a big problem. Some people suggested installing cameras to increase safety, and short-term rental owners should just follow best practices, which everyone who participated, clearly that's what they're doing. So these are the arguments from people in favor of short-term rentals. Now, the information and arguments against short-term rentals that I got from looking at all the materials was that short-term rentals negatively affects communities. It makes housing more expensive. It increases taxes because for everyone, absentee owners don't care about the community, so they're the ones more likely to have party houses and not address neighbors' concerns. Short-term rentals negatively affect the character of the town by making it more transient, and being more transient was a negative quality. Non-resident investors only care about money, and they don't care about the community. So again, this is not me, this is what people were saying. Another argument was that short-term rentals are a commercial use of residential homes. People were complaining that short-term rentals are a hotel. It's a commercial endeavor. If it looks like a hotel, what's the expression?
Looks like a duck and walks like a duck. It's a duck.
It's a duck. Good. So that was one of them. It's a hotel. Residential areas are not designed or zoned for hotel use. That was the second argument. That was a big argument. The short-term rentals are commercial use of residential homes, and with it they bring commercial problems to the residential area. Short-term rentals decrease the quality of life for neighbors. So, increased noise, party houses, trash, transient people who are rude, parking issues because too many cars, parking issues, narrow streets, too many occupants, police involvement, changing character of community, trespassing by short-term rental guests, dangerous water use, jet skis in swimming areas, and again, the absent owner who doesn't really care about any of this stuff because they don't see it. So I did make counter arguments against these folks' positions. So, short-term rental adversely affects community is the argument. They're no good because they negatively affect the community. So the counter argument is that property owners have a right to rent their property. And there really is no difference between 7 days and 3 days. There's no difference, and no one could actually state a difference. So I didn't see that. Counter argument to the argument that short-term rental is a commercial use of property. The counter argument is that Owners who rent for 7 days, it's also a hotel, motel, or resort. It's a vacation rental. It's a business just like short-term rental. And this kind of goes with the court decision in the appellate court that they just couldn't see a difference between 7 days or 3 days, and they weren't going to be the ones to call that out. Owners who rent for a week are not required to live in a home, so why should an owner who rents for 3 days be required to live in that home? Weekly guests are just as transient as guests who stay there for 2 or 3 days, so there's no difference. If short-term rentals are unlawful in East Lyme, then that means a week is unlawful and 3 days is unlawful. So they're all in the same boat. Even people who are saying 7 days is good, there's no distinction. So residents who are against short-term rentals, they made some suggestions on how to coexist, and they were similar. Registration process, have a permit. And there was a lot of people, several people talked about the minimal rental period of 7 days. Occupancy limits for each house, limit the number of cars, have accessible owners of short-term rentals. So if there's a problem, we can get in touch with the owners. Trash collection needs to be better. Inspections of homes for safety, fire, stuff like that. Some people said we should look to surrounding towns to see what kind of regulations they have. Some people suggested owner occupancy. Too many drunk guests causing problems. I believe someone mentioned that Oak Grove Beach has a minimum of 7-day rentals, and that was how they compromised by voting on a 7-day rental. That's what someone said. I did not confirm that.
Yeah, you know what, just if I can jump in there.
Go ahead.
I was just looking at that today, and it's a recommendation.
Oh, okay.
So it's not,
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a suggestion. Right, okay. And then someone recommended a moratorium because short-term rentals are not a permitted use. So this was my analysis of what the residents of the town have said, and arguments just for the sake, counter-arguments just for the sake of argument and sake of discussion.
Thanks, Gary. It's a lot of information. I know it's a lot to go through, but a good summary of kind of everything we've heard in one place. That's what we were after, right. Because we've had, the public comments, we've had emails, we've had letters, et cetera. So this kind of sums up the details, if you will. So that's great. So using this as a backdrop, I think we can, and some other information that was given to you in the last week. I had, Brooke had emailed to you. This is the updated information from Southeast Connecticut COG. I had read this article, the original one, which was getting kind of old, and then it just happened that around the time of our last meeting, maybe right after it or something, I'm not exactly sure, this was updated. So it does give you a nice little chart, gives you a good overview of what's happening in the area and an updated chart of towns around us and, whether they permit STRs and how they if they regulate them, and if so, how. That was one thing. And then the video webinar, which I hope you were able to watch, that was another one. It was a Granicus webinar. And Mr. Mulholland, our zoning official, forwarded that to me. And that was very good for the topic of goal setting, which, Gary, you were particularly interested in. So I don't know, have other folks here listened to that? Were you able to take a look at that video? Yeah, not yet. Okay. So that one was it was about an hour plus long, maybe hour and 15. The gentleman giving the presentation was very good. He could have shortened it a bit, but that's okay. But his main point was that and he goes over what these goals are, but you need to identify your goals before you are at all interested in, coming up with solutions. And we've talked about this. I think it was at our last meeting, the topic of goals came up about keeping in mind issues like affordable housing, putting caps on, doing things, to identifying your goals and then coming up with the appropriate solutions. So I found that very helpful, and I think going forward, I highly recommend that. So, you can just click it on. I think it worked pretty well. So those were two pieces of information or two resources that I think were very helpful. And I didn't find the Granicus webinar slanted or biased. What you're going to find in this whole realm of short-term rentals, for example, Airbnb's got their little toolkit, and it's got some good thoughts, but we know how that's oriented. So again, know your sources. So something like the Southeast Connecticut COG is going to try to give you something, at least from the municipal perspective. So it's at least a little more open-minded. Balancing various rights and so forth, and same with Granicus. I think that's the attempt there. So, but I'd like to get to the topic of goals because, and again, backdrop your information, backdrop Attorney Zamarka's information about the pending case. But even knowing the pending case is going to impact us, right? It's going to impact us in some way, likely. I still think we can have a good discussion about what would you like to achieve.
I agree.
So anywhere, we can start anywhere. Greg, if you want to jump in?
So, I think I've handed out to the committee before a short proposal that would apply to all rentals with short-term or of any length, which would be to require a permit with a fee and an inspection. Part of that would be contact numbers on the application for the permit for the owner, as well, or if not the owner, somebody in town that the police can contact when they're called.
So you're thinking of a permitting scheme, okay, or when I say scheme, I use that in a non-negative way. Process. So. And back up for a minute, if we can get to goals. So what is it that you want to try to address, resolve by having a permitting system? What is it? What are those overarching goals that since you've been on the committee, that you could identify, if any?
Well, if we go back to some of the things that have been talked about, a permitting system helps the police, as Chief Finkelstein said when he was here, more information is better than less. Right? Permitting system provides contact information so that the owners can be contacted when there are issues. Not just the renters, because the renters usually aren't going to do anything about it. I think that there are all kinds of good suggestions about, number of occupants / number of bedrooms. There are also good counter arguments that, when I have Christmas at my house, I have 15 people there, and, we stash kids in bedrooms that aren't really qualified. So I'm not big on that. I want the town to know who is renting and where and how they can be contacted, and that they're renting a place that's safe. We're not going to have, the extreme, of course, is the dying from, carbon monoxide poisoning in a house that hasn't been inspected in 25 years. I'm not saying that's going to happen. Nobody ever says that's going to happen, but it would be an awful thing. It would certainly put East Lyme in the news for all the wrong reasons. So I'm not asking for much. I don't really want a lot. I don't want to ban short-term rentals. I don't want to limit them to 7 days. as I've said before, one of the rentals in our town that was for 7 days was one of the worst ones in terms of noise and crowds and cars and everything else. So I really just was hoping that the commission could recommend to the selectmen that we establish a permit system with a fee to counter the expenses to the town for monitoring that permit system. And that it would require, as the fire marshal said, a short 15-minute inspection. And that person, the fee, the salary for that part-time position would be offset by the fees from the permit application.
So you're having a fee involved in the structure of what you are recommending, what you're thinking about.
I think that too falls under a goal of making owners more responsible.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think, right. So, yeah, I'm just trying us to look here first, at goals.
Mhm.
And I know we know some things we'd like to correct, but before we get there, I still think identify those goals, because once you do that, then you can figure ways to accomplish your goal a little better. So your recommendation is outside of zoning? Are you thinking ordinance? Is that what you're thinking by way of this regulatory process?
I don't think it'll be an ordinance. I think it'll be up to zoning to administrate this. I think the permit list per se will be shared with the police department,
Interesting.
so they have access to it.
Okay. Yes, so,
I don't think that, and maybe Mark could comment, but I don't think this would fall into an ordinance per se. It would, and that raises some issues with, again, with Black Point and, Crescent Beach, and people that have their own zoning.
so it's interesting because some of the topics that you've covered sometimes have been seen in some of these ordinances and expected to be in an ordinance.
Yeah.
And I'll just throw this
So,
out there.
it could be
Yeah,
an ordinance.
I'll just throw this out there now. I after looking at the material and watching the video, the webinar, which was very helpful, looking again at this Southeast Connecticut, what's happening around us, and the pending case before the Connecticut Supreme Court, my tendency is to think, let's approach it by way of zoning. It doesn't mean that we can't address what's happening in the beach communities, because 3 of those communities have their own zoning, which could follow our zoning, and the others would be presumably affected directly by what we would choose. But I was really concerned about this idea that that we have permissive zoning, and that it's a little troubling that we address this, we address that, we address bed and breakfasts, but we're not addressing this. And I'm not comfortable legally and just non-legally too, thinking that we would come up with a solution that somehow could potentially be at odds with the regulation, of land use regulation. I didn't want to have something happening out there in ordinance land that wasn't compatible with zoning. So I think we could start with zoning, but that's a long-term solution. Last time we were talking about goals, we started the conversation about goals, we were talking short-term and long-term. So I also have in my thinking, I'm thinking there's that's my long-term solution. My short-term solution we can get into later, doesn't even address zoning. It just addresses many of the things that Chief brought up to us about noise, the noise regulation, parking, how we can properly address parking through the police commission. So I kind of divided the world into short-term goals, because we're stuck with this situation of waiting on a Supreme Court decision. Yeah.
Excuse me, I know you were talking about going down the zoning path,
Mm-hmm.
but Attorney Zamarka, did you not recommend that whatever we do, we lean towards ordinance rather than zoning, because an ordinance supersedes
We'll cover the whole
beach
town.
community zoning?
It's not necessarily superseding, but as we know in East Lyme, there are 3 beach communities. that have their own zoning and are not required to comply with the East Lyme zoning regulations. So, and dealing with this matter in whatever fashion via a zoning regulation would not apply to those communities.
So was it your recommendation that whatever we do, we make it an ordinance?
Well, that is what would apply townwide, yes.
Okay, thanks.
My,
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah,
my feeling on that subject is, I think this area is extremely complicated, but I think that Attorney Zamarka gave us a good, a good explanation, as versus zoning versus an ordinance. And I'm from Black Point. We do have our own zoning on this issue, but I do feel that there is the issues of enforcement. All of our rules and regulation is difficult, and zoning is going to be prospective in the future. That's just not sort of solving the problems that Oak Grove has got today, for example, or some of the other beaches or rentals throughout town. And again, not to make something to solve one specific problem, to make one rule it's across the board. But I think Greg's suggestion of registration and permitting is at least one item. But that, in my opinion, that should be a town ordinance. Whether that way at least you're getting an inventory of what you do have and you don't have. And I don't see a zoning enforcement situation. If you violate it, basically you have a lawsuit, to really try to enforce it. And if you put an ordinance in, that's a little different, situation. And so I think an ordinance is more appropriate because it also, it would, there's no grandfathering. It would go back to, 50 years or whatever, go backwards. So anybody who does have one today would have to comply, with that. And I'm not saying that zoning shouldn't someday address this issue, but that's a different board to do that. I think the zoning board would, in my opinion, would look at that. I have a lot of problems, with distinguishing where these lines are drawn, which you heard me talk about before, between commercial and residential, et cetera, et cetera. But just even to put it into, the old-fashioned Kool-Aid stand that we've all talked about, well, maybe not here, but towns have talked about for years. When do you regulate a Kool-Aid stand? And then when do you become a restaurant? When you become a commercial use? And would we like to have a restaurant, just suddenly open up a Kool-Aid stand and starting to sell snacks and this, that, and the other thing on every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 10 hours a day, right next to you, versus the occasional kid who goes out there. And so we're taking, the same thing here. You have rooming homes, you have bed and breakfasts, and you have inspections, you have fees, you have registrations on those issues. So I think Greg's comments about that is, obviously makes some sense. And, but, if you put yourself, again, we've heard a lot of people speak to come to the hearings, and these people have spoken, they have a vested interest, but, but we represent the silent majority too. You've got whatever number of people we have in town, 10,000 people, and then it balloons up in the summers also. And, would you want, a hotel, next to you, and again, the income streams, evaluations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the schedule that you went over with here at great length, it was fantastic. You listen to the pros and the cons. I mean, it's just, extremely well done. And I think, so my problem is, where do all these lines, get drawn? This is far bigger. And the Supreme Court case, what they're ruling on, I don't really see what has tremendous, aspect to what we're doing here. We have a short-term rental at Black Point, 7 days. We've had some people violate it, and that I've heard. It's, we don't have a complete nuisance problem, but that could occur at any given time. as we're having at Oak Grove. And, but we also, but this is America, and we don't want too many regulations, but, who would want a, restaurant opening up next door to them, and we have strict restrictions on that, who'd want or another one, a perfect example is somebody who runs a garage. They do work out of their homes and they go to the next level and run a garage.
So look,
So I mean, I think these have these lines, and there is a line here somewhere. I don't know how we resolve it.
Yes, so
that's my concern. Number one, I think it should be an ordinance, whatever we do.
okay.
Let me reiterate that I agree with that. Also, I really don't have the experience to know how this would be administrated. It could be administrated through the police department, for all I know.
So, yeah, just a comment. I mean, let's take one step back and still go back to goals. I don't mean to harp on that, but if I really think that. So, Gary, you mentioned a number of arguments, counter arguments embedded in all this information from the public, and clearly you see we've identified competing interests. The interests of the land, of the homeowner,
Right.
or owner of this of the residents, versus the community at large, the effect that has on that neighborhood, the community at large. So it could be quality of life issues, it could be affordable housing issues, etc. So that's kind of where I want us to at least think first, if that's okay. I mean, I jumped in and told you, I got to the end point about what I was thinking, and it's not written in stone. I have been like this on this topic. I started with zoning, I went to ordinance, then I went back to zoning, just because I'm trying to figure out how to resolve everything. But for the moment being, I think if we can really pinpoint major concerns, I mean, so, for example, have we heard enough that tells us that, yeah, there's some trouble. There may not be party houses everywhere, but clearly there's been enough evidence to tell us that there is either the changing of neighborhood or the potential for changing neighborhood. So is that something that's a concern and you'd like to address? That's what I kind of want us to, in our heads, be there first before
Right.
we jump to that part C here, 5C. We're still on 5B. And it's good, I mean, it's okay, we can go back and forth, but I do think we still have to say, I want to make sure, here, we're going to protect all owners of STRs as much as possible. I think what I'm hearing is a kind of balancing. Do you agree, Ann?
What I go back to is I don't know if we have a sense of what the greater community thinks, because the first two hearings, the owners were contacted and, encouraged to come and speak. When early on, people that didn't know about this weren't contacted, and, a word of mouth has, had a few people come, but I think another hearing that's really advertised to the whole community, so we don't just get the viewpoint of, mostly the owners. I just think we don't have a good representation yet, just because people did not know about it, but the owners were contacted and encouraged to come.
Okay, so one goal is get more info from, let's see, it's page 3 of your report.
I think the greater community should have input.
More input, if we can get it,
Mm-hmm.
on the 3rd page of residents' arguments against them, or finding issue with them.
Or just what they think.
Or what they think, even if it's not that they're against, they could be for, but just more of the non-owner of an STR coming forth. Is that, do we feel as a group? Because we talked about this last time, that we thought we needed another public hearing. As it turns out, most of you know that hearing date that we chose ends up being swearing-in day, and it doesn't work for a lot of reasons.
If I may.
So.
In my reading, I've seen a few towns, local in this area, if I recall, it was in Connecticut, they sent out surveys townwide surveys to get information.
Okay.
Sounds like a big endeavor. I think researching and reading supplements the comments from people. I mean, I think we can look to other towns and things that you read. If you read, get your sources correct, and you're not just reading special interest stuff. So we can look to other towns and read documents and articles to gather that and to fill the holes. That's what I think. So I don't think we need to hear from every resident.
Yeah, I don't think we need a voter referendum, and I don't even think we need a survey. I think just another hearing and that opportunity would probably suffice. And now that we have the website going, it's a little bit clearer.
I think it might be helpful if, before we have the next public hearing, that we give the public a sense of the direction the committee is going in.
Right.
Identifying our goals, perhaps circling around the coexistence ideas from Gary's
If that's
really
what,
excellent summary.
Yes.
And say, we've heard testimony, here's the 3 or 4 things we are trying to achieve strategically.
Okay.
And in my mind, it's transparency, accountability, and enforcement.
Yeah.
Whatever we decide, got to have some teeth in it. Because at least in my community, people don't know where to turn because they come to the neighborhood association. We say, we've got no enforcement ability on this. So whatever it is that we're going to do, if we give the public a sense of where we've planted some flags, they can come and react to that, and we can modify our positions based on that.
Yeah, I would have to agree. As I said before, I really hesitate to have another public hearing without at least a straw man proposal for the public to look at.
I agree.
Right.
Because otherwise we'll just hear the same things we've heard
Yes,
before.
and that's unnecessary, absolutely unnecessary, and it's not a good use of time for sure.
What we're I mean, I'm not so sure where I would fall on any of this stuff, depending what we put up for, recommendations and et cetera, et cetera. And you've got plenty of people who, have, successfully, use this method, and, for all these good reasons. And Gary did a phenomenal job putting the pros and cons. And, but, I mean, if somebody can throw out, an idea, Greg mentioned, registration and stuff, but, and permits, which makes sense to me, but, that is, when Chief Finkelstein, talked about parking, for example, so, I know in Oak Grove, I would highly suggest that they, go ahead and talk to the police commission, which came out of that, which I thought was very valuable, sort of give at least anybody in this situation some teeth that they could tow cars and get them out of there on the streets and everything, which we can't do. I thought that was extremely valuable. But, as far as, we've got some really heavy, in my opinion, heavy constitutional issues here that go beyond, when you start talking about what, attorneys of market said, buying, selling, and renting, and then, the definition of what is a single-family home and what is, transient and single-family living, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is probably way above, our levels here, but I think that it plays into, I mean, if somebody was to determine that, a nightly rental, again, we have rooming houses and we have boarding homes and we have bed and breakfasts, and if you were in the home and staying there and bring a guest in and rent that, or rent a room out of your home, even on a nightly basis, but you're there, or even as, another commissioner mentioned, there was a home and right next door they have an SDR, they're there, and, and you have somebody, who's there to monitor this stuff, and, and that's, to me, that's like if you had a hotel and you had cottages, out there, somebody's monitoring it. Whereas when you're just, doing, leaving the keys at the desk and who knows, I mean, at the doorway, and you're doing everything online, who knows who's coming in, who's going, et cetera, et cetera. And the taxing and the enforceability of all this. But again, I think that is so far, in my opinion, those are constitutional issues that are going way, way, and I'm no
Yeah.
lawyer, but it seems to me. So what's a practical way we could address this, and what practically could we put in? And I don't, and at least I'm glad Greg's got a couple things he's mentioned here, but, what are other people's thoughts of what we could possibly come up with ideas
So,
to do something?
I think we could, Gary, your point about us having, and Greg as well, having something, our ideas at least formulated. They may not be, final or even midpoint, but we can definitely formulate enough idea here so that we can articulate that to the public. So let's say we enumerate 3 goals, and then we come up with things we would like, how we'd like to address those goals. We don't know, maybe because there may be a difference of opinion, zoning versus ordinance, or a combination thereof. You can still come up with these are things that we really are concerned about, and we think there should be some regulation, and if we do regulate, this is what we're looking at so far. So a kind of, a midpoint thought.
And
of
then
it.
the bottom level, how to enforce it.
Yes, absolutely, how to enforce. So going down the line here, I'm just going to ask everyone to just name a goal. It might be your goal is affordable housing that you just want to protect and that you think is in jeopardy. Or it might be home ownership should be as absolute as possible. So, I mean, whatever you think you would like to try to achieve, or and then I think we can move on to a couple of things we've identified as issues and a couple of solutions, just so we have a kind of nascent sort of, a first crack at it, because we have to start someplace. I know it's difficult. It's like looking at that blank page when you have to write an essay. It's the same thing. We have a lot of ideas, but I think we have to start putting pen to paper. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to start with you,
Sure.
Gary. So, what big goal do you have?
Big goal, East Lyme has to take charge of its own town, and it can't I have an issue with special interests. Everything's a special interest.
Mm-hmm.
Special interest, the short-term rental owners are a special interest. Taxpayers are a special interest, but taxpayers get forgotten. Residents get forgotten. That residents of the town, we have the most skin in the game in East Lyme. I look to the future, and I see a lot of mom and pop operations, if you will, getting bought out to bigger investors. And then they're going to be a special interest. And why do we need to allow that special interest to tell us what to do, to dictate? Because the law says, apparently, we don't allow short-term rentals. So if we don't allow short-term rentals, then why should we give it up? We can have these constitutional arguments, which is legitimate, and if it's found that the bundle of rights includes rental, the ability to rent for an hour, then this is what I see happening. The choice is either we ban short-term rentals, or we allow short-term rentals free rein to do whatever they want. In the middle is I see the middle just being a big problem of enforcement, rules and regulations that many towns have already tried. It's just not working. So I see the real issue coming down to: do we ban them, or just have no regulations on them? Just do what you can have some registration, that kind of nonsense. But that's what I see it coming down to. And banning them, I don't know. That's a tough one.
Okay. Ann?
My biggest goal would be to define what is a residential neighborhood and what is a commercial neighborhood. I mean, you look at people who, investors out of town buy these, they're rented year round. They're basically a bed and breakfast. And bed and breakfast require so much parking, they require permits, they require health codes. And you're putting those in residential neighborhoods. So if you're going to have these rentals, should they be in residential neighborhoods or should they be, are they a commercial business and should they be in the commercial neighborhood? I think those have to be defined.
Okay, so location is an issue, obviously. Okay, and I'll skip me for now, but we'll go down this way. Gary, you as well. Okay.
I think the goals, well, for me, the goals are transparency. People need to know what the rules are, and they should be, I think, the same in Oak Grove as they are in Saunders Point, as they are in Flanders. So transparency is a big thing for me. Accountability is a big thing for me. That's accountability both for the neighbors and for the renters, the owner renters. And lastly, whatever those things produce in the way of regulations, there needs to be enforcement for this. And those three things, those three overarching strategic goals, kind of led me back to Greg's original idea of a registration and a permitting process. The fire marshal, Bill Bundy, he told us that there's a handful of lodging houses in the town right now. And those lodging houses annually register, they apply for a permit, they get inspected, and a permit is issued. To me, that hits all my trigger points of transparency, accountability, and enforcement. If the renter-owner does not register or does not get a permit, or for whatever reason that permit is yanked, that person's out of business. I think the argument about whether we're living in commercial neighborhoods or residential neighborhoods is somewhat convoluted now, because in my neighborhood there's an insurance broker who works out of his home. There's a therapist who works out of his home, her home. There's a financial guy who conducts his business out of his home. I'm a freelance writer. I write from my house. There's a lot of business going on in our neighborhood.
But then those are businesses that don't require a lot of parking and things like the health codes and things
That
like
is true.
that.
That is true.
Yeah,
They're
those are-
different. They're different types of business.
And our zoning regulations do address those types of expected home
Businesses.
occupancy.
It's owner occupied.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and right, the businesses within the house, right, but yeah.
So
Okay,
a registration process where the owner-renter provides contact information, provides number of bedrooms, whatever needs to be on that form, and make that form available not only to police and to fire and to ambulance, but post it on the website so the entire town has a sense of how many rental units there are in the town. And if that number, let's say it's 200, jumps to 400, then we have a different situation on our hands.
so that has you have a public safety goal in your, I'm hearing, in your registration process that Greg has articulated. Okay,
Yes.
all right. And Greg, if you want to add anything to what you
My
articulated.
overarching goal is preservation of community. You know, I used to have neighbors. Now I have renters that are there for 24 hours. They're not bad. Nobody said they were bad people, but they're not neighbors. You know, I don't know them. I don't know their families. I don't know their grandparents. I don't know where they work, and I'm never going to know them. It's just the way it is. So, I come back to, I appreciate Gary's comments, but I'm not trying to ban anything, because I've said before in this forum, East Lyme has a long history of people renting a room or renting their house for the summer, or an academic rental, or all kinds of renting going on. It's the business, as Ann has articulated, that seems to have infiltrated our community, where we aren't supposed to have, quote, businesses, but Gary's comments are germane, that people are working out of their homes now. It's a different time. So my primary goal is to maintain a sense of community.
Okay, thank you. John?
Fairness.
Fairness, okay.
I think that Gary talks about, sense of community, that makes, those are very, Greg, they're very good points. And, but, you've got to be, fair also, protecting the rights of the people that want to rent short-term rentals too. Look at that, if it's applicable, if it's allowed, if it's fair. I don't think you want me running a diesel repair shop next to your home, and I'm the right, I can do anything I want, so I think there is that line. So I think it has to be fair, and then it has to be, and these people that own these and invest in these, I assume if we do have an ordinance and this, that, and they are registered, I think they need to be, submit their annual income expense statements to the town, just like any other business would, a hotel would, and be taxed appropriately, be assessed and taxed appropriately. I don't
Okay,
think
we'll
it's
get
fair.
to that. We can get to the
that's-
elements
that
that you
goes to
want to
fairness.
review, that you're thinking
Yeah,
about
yeah, I mean,
having the assessor's office
and because
look at these
effectively-
things differently.
And then does
Okay.
that get considered for Greg's value on his house, who lives next door to it? Does it devalue his house?
That probably goes the other way.
Or maybe value, well, if you were to sell it for that, But definitely the people, so my goal, where we come out of this thing, would be, I think that, there has to be fairness to everybody in the town. And if you're gonna choose to go in that route.
Sure. So similarly for myself, similar to the fairness concept, I just want to make sure that we balance these competing interests very well, and that we don't, confer extra benefits on special interests versus residents living in neighborhoods. But and to finally grapple with the fact that there's a cottage industry that's been going on, and now in the last 5 to 7 years, it's exploded because we have other people coming in, maybe within our community too, but also those coming from without, who are seeing this opportunity, and then it's changing something for us in a way that we don't necessarily want changed. This is not what we bought into when we purchased our homes. So, but I want to make sure that we balance those competing interests. That's one. And then the second thing is, I am concerned about this whole thing about zoning versus ordinance and the actual legal approach we take. That I just want to make sure that, I'm sure we can be challenged either way, zoning or ordinance, but I just want to make sure that, if the ordinance is written and it just, it's written, it's got to be written in a way that's kind of assuming, right? It's assuming that we're allowing short-term rentals. So that's where I have a block, and it's the legal block in my head, and it might be in your head, Gary, as well, that
You're right.
it's a problem.
Now, if I recall, Ledger wrote an ordinance, and then they got rid of it. They didn't like it, and they went to a zoning regulation.
And this.
But they did both of them. So they didn't like, and I think it was they did the ordinance first, and they said it was not. They didn't have enough enforcement. They wanted a zoning officer involved, so they went back to the reg. So that's a local town that tried both, and
Yeah, and Preston might be similar. That's having two things going on. It might have an ordinance, and it also is doing the application process that you go through, planning and zoning. and they are now putting a moratorium. I just read this a couple of days
Right.
ago. You guys probably have seen it in the day
In
paper.
the day, yeah.
But this would be a good town to go and look exactly what's on the books there, what worked, what didn't. It seemed like they're very concerned about affordable housing. So that's my other concern is if we're trying in this town to, have more affordable housing across the board, not even within the purview of the state statute, but just generally make this town more affordable, end of story. That is another goal of mine, and I don't want to see so many housing units being sucked up into short-term rentals. So that's a issue I have. I'm even thinking once we get to that point of methods of solving problems, I'm thinking even caps, and that was something suggested by the gentleman who is in that video in the webinar. You'll see capping it, and that's some towns have done that, and they start with a low number, not a high number because it's hard to roll it back, but they start with a low number, and that's something to think about. But, okay, so these are all, these are great goals, and I think we've articulated them well. So now let's just briefly, so we're not, spend your entire night here, briefly go into just some of the ways that, again, zoning versus ordinance. We don't have to even resolve that tonight, because that'll also need Attorney Zamarka's additional input, et cetera. So let's just get to, what would you like to see in let's just call it regulating these things, if we're going to take a regulatory approach, if we're going to do more than nothing, okay, and we're going to do something, okay, what would be those, we'll start that way down, okay, start with John. Name the first thing that you'd like to see, or one or two things that you'd like to see if we were to and this is a long-term solution. We'll get to the short-term one later. But in your long-term solution of this short-term rental thing, from everything we've heard so far, and this is just, we'll call it your draft. Okay, this is all draft because we're in the middle of it. I don't see that we're beyond the middle point at all, even though we have a January 17th alleged deadline.
Well, on that issue alone, I think this is far more complicated personally than putting a deadline at January 17th.
And it's not really a deadline. It was just a
considerable amount of
suggestion.
time, and then you've
Yeah.
got, you've got pre-existing and post, and so I think that and it's very, very complicated, and you got people who traditionally use Airbnb when start out just doing rooms, and there was an occupied home versus an unoccupied home.
Mm-hmm.
So those are out there. They're all, so I see all that. You come up with a regulation, even points to a regulation. I could be similar with Gary. I could argue any one of these things. I can argue both ways very easily. And so to ask,
Did you see?
what would my, what would I like to see? As of today, I mean, I think that I look at registration like Greg says, and I agree that we probably should have a regulation on that particular issue. But does that preclude? Does that require a homeowner who rents out his room? How this whole thing started? Everybody started just renting out a room. That they should have to register, have their home inspected. And who lives there? They're renting out their room. If they want to rent out the room on a monthly or annual basis, they don't have any of this. But if they're running where's the cross line between that and a bed and breakfast? So, and should they have to be versus somebody who buys a home and buys 5 homes and runs it clearly as a business, totally as a business.
So
where does the state come in
okay,
on that issue?
So what I'm hearing from you, John, is some sort of a registration process, a fee, maybe inspection, this kind of thing.
Well,
But without
inspection,
getting into
I'm not
numbers.
even on the inspection thing.
Okay.
We don't inspect weekly rentals or monthly rentals or annual, or homes. Once you have your CO,
True.
right? So again, where's that line cross? And and it seems to me that where's that business? One is a business and one is a individual. So obviously you can see that in my mind, in my limited non-lawyer mind, these to me are just constitutional issues that are, so I don't know. I can't answer your question, I
Okay,
guess. to
but you
what I
at
would-
least you're thinking
Right.
that if
Right.
you're going to regulate, it's gonna look like a registration, a permitting fee, maybe some kind of inspection, even though you know you've gotta define your universe.
For something that is
Okay.
100% that way, I'm not so sure. Somebody
Okay.
does this on a occasional basis.
Okay,
Where's that line drawn? You know, if it's done,
3 minutes is up.
yeah, through, well,
3 minutes is
either
up.
that, or if it's, you know,
right.
So,
So,
somebody
yeah, I
does
mean-
it, 50% of the time, or 25% of the time of the year. Where's that
All
break?
right, so-
Where somebody's doing 100%.
Yeah, so you have to define your
100%, I
universe.
agree with,
Okay, and then Greg, so for you,
100%.
So the
things that you
question is-
mentioned.
Yeah,
Repeat the question.
you know, I'm fairly steady in what I'm asking for. I want a registration. I'm not as sensitive as John is about it. If you're gonna rent and make money, then you need a permit. I will promise the committee this, I will find out before our next meeting what kind of permit systems we have now, whether it's bed and breakfast, whether it's lodging,
Yes.
whether it's
It's in our
hotels,
zoning regs.
whatever it
Yeah,
is.
it's
I will
definitely in there.
tabulate those and bring
Yes.
those back to us.
Yeah, that's fine. And,
Thank you.
it's definitely in there because that was a starting point for me months ago, was just looking at that. Yeah, for sure. And Ann, I'm sure, knows all of that. So Gary, do you have any, in the regulatory universe, what would be the kinds of things that you'd be concerned about? And it could be some of the things that some of the residents raised. And this doesn't have to be terribly specific at this point, but something that for anyone coming to a public hearing knows that we all kind of are thinking of, at least we agree on 3 things, that might be in our regulatory scheme.
So I agree with Greg that the registration and permitting, it rings the bell for me on transparency, it rings the bell on accountability. And Police Chief Finkelstein said, more information is always better. And this would provide that, not only for the police, not only for the fire and ambulance, but for the residents, that they can keep track of how many homes in their neighborhood are actually being rented, and who's owning that, and when there are problems, who do you contact?
Well, also,
Conversely, it could also be, if it was public, it could be a marketing ploy for the renter owners. And that people could go to the town website and see, oh, this address is available, I'll see if I can rent that place. So that covers the transparency aspects for me. I did what Gary did, although not nearly as exhaustively or detailed. And it looked to me like among the concerns, the two that kept coming up were parking and occupancy. So I think that we should put those 2 on the list of, if we're going to regulate, if we're going to go down this registration and permitting thing, those would be 2 issues we'd also be looking at.
Okay. Ann, what are you thinking? If we have to enter the world of regulation, what would be top for you?
To me, ownership responsibility is a huge one, and I think that there should be a number for people in the community. If there's a problem at a house, the owner should provide a number for them to call. There should be someone available to take care of any issue that comes up.
So make sure we have
Contact
contact
numbers.
info.
That's part of the permit thing.
That's part of the
Yeah.
permitting process.
Registration.
But an owner could go on a cruise, and there
Yes.
should be somebody always available if
Yes.
there's an issue that comes up.
Making so much money, they can go on it.
That's right.
But this has nothing to do with anything, but I just read an article where in Canada, people are renting out half of their queen-size bed for $650 a month to help make money, and people are renting them. So just,
Okay.
there's all things going on.
Who knew?
Yeah.
Okay.
Put a good sword in that book.
Oh my God. Okay.
Okay,
Gary,
so-
thanks.
The registration and permit, that's a low bar, that's a necessity. parking occupancy issues, that brings it up a bit. And the three things that I'm looking at is possible things that we can consider: caps,
Yes,
the
that's
cap,
good. That's-
capping the number of short-term rentals in town, possible zones. Maybe you have different, different areas. Beach areas can be, maybe they're different than, neighborhood areas where schools are, that type of thing. And maybe we also have a lottery system for the permits. So if we have X number of permits, maybe we have a lottery each year, each whatever, so that no single home in perpetuity is now a quote-unquote hotel. Because two neighbors next to each other, one does a short-term rental, one doesn't, one gets a permit in perpetuity, why should his house be worth $3 million and the other guy $500,000 if it's the same place? So a lottery system could also reduce the attractiveness for outside investors, because it's not a guaranteed stream of constant money. Because these things, you can collect $15,000, $20,000 a month as opposed to $2,000 a month. So a lottery system along with a cap, it's just an idea. I'm just throwing stuff out
No, I
there.
think these are, again, once we've gone through that analysis of goals, this helps us think
Right.
through.
Farm zones, maybe a
Yeah.
farmer has a short-term rental, and noise and parking, those are not issues
Right,
in a farm
correct.
area.
Correct.
So-
Okay, so these are the items that we've been talking about. I also I'm thinking along the line, beside the registration permitting, I'm thinking about caps for sure. Because the overall thing I've been hearing kind of from all sides is that the short-term rentals, it's not that we want to encourage them, and it's kind of something that exists that we need to deal with, but it's not something we want to, say that, okay, everyone that can do it, let's do it.
Right.
So I think, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn that way, but that's my overall sense of it, from the commentary that we've heard in our past meetings. So it's not that in certain circumstances it isn't idealistic or perfect or works well, but generally speaking, it's kind of a given, and we have to deal with it. And so that given is not necessarily one that we want to, allow to be mushroomed. So
Are we losing sight of how this whole thing was started, though? If you put caps on, if you do lotteries, if you basically you're raising the barrier of entry, for the people.
yeah,
So that where's the sense of
just-
fairness to
right, it's a
everybody in
thought.
town? I'm just
Yeah.
being a counter to that, and how this all started. In my understanding, how this all started was we had a problem at one of the beach communities, specifically, and and there was there's nothing that our enforcement divisions could do about it without having a zoning or an ordinance or something or a regulation, something to do with that. And not, and really, except for the idea of the Police Chief Finkelstein mentioning, the idea of the parking thing, the street parking,
yes,
was one potential issue to try to at least allow them to enforce something. Really, and nothing that we've talked about here is talking about enforcement issues. And
right.
and if you called, and if there's a short-term rental and there's a problem, and you call the owner, okay, the owner, you call them up, okay, well, thank you very much. If you call
Yeah.
most owners of most commercial businesses and most commercial properties, they'll say, okay, I'll let my maintenance guy deal with this next week.
But if you impose substantial fines,
Yeah,
if it
so-
keeps happening,
How
Well,
about we
that's
add,
no issue,
how about we add enforcement and fines, as something that we definitely
Right, but you have
need.
to have something that violates,
Yes.
they broke. And the noise
Mhm.
issue, we've already,
Yes.
we talked about at length, it doesn't seem to be enforceable as it currently is written,
Okay.
today. So that leads into the, zoning issues and well, Mr.
Okay.
Zamar could fill us in better about that, where that would fall into,
I think permitting process is where we can really look at these things.
Mm-hmm.
Without the permit, you can't rent.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I mean,
what goes into getting the permit?
mm-hmm. Right, well, we have,
Yeah, permits.
okay.
Makes sense. It's a good place
So
to
I
start.
see as our, for a long-term solution, again, we don't know what's happening with the Supreme Court decision, but this is what these are some of the features of regulation that we would want to be, addressing. I just don't want to lose that piece about the short-term solutions, because I think we could make earlier recommendation to Board of Selectmen about the noise ordinance, and just, maybe having them, get rid of the clutter in that ordinance and deal with establishing a reasonableness standard that the state uses. Beef up, perhaps its ability to be enforced, have to take a look at that. And then the parking, for sure, there has to be some communication, if Board of Selectmen think this is a good idea, with the beach communities, that if you have an area, this is totally aside from any regulatory process we have here that we're trying to adopt, but that if you have issues with parking, they may very well be resolved by approaching the police commission, addressing the commission with your issue, and then a study is done, and engineering gets involved, whatever has to get involved, and then perhaps you have the appropriate signage put up. So I think we can't lose sight of these pieces that could be very helpful in the interim. Just a thought, if we want to throw that in, not necessarily here, but as just something that, going forward, I didn't want to lose sight of steps we can take sooner than later that certainly don't harm us. We can still do the long term. Just a thought. So what I'm thinking here is, that we still may need one more meeting. Don't know if Ann and I will be involved in that meeting, but we still need one more meeting to, especially with the rest of the board or any new member of the board, new members of the board being seated, that it would probably, before you do another, if I can say, do another public hearing, I can summarize this stuff, and obviously we'll have our minutes, but I think putting together something that can be used for the next meeting with members who are missing tonight or any new members, and just say this is what we agree with. We're all in pretty much, there's a consensus about our goals and a consensus about how we want to achieve those goals. And we don't know the total legalities of methods yet. We're leaning one way, but we're not sure of that, okay? And then have that final discussion maybe at your next meeting. I think that might be good before you jump to the public hearing.
Agreed.
Because we need, I know this was a little bit in the weeds tonight, but we did need to really kind of home in enough.
We did, yeah.
Because there was just so much information, and we were getting lost there with, a little bit with all that info. So does that seem like a plan to work on putting together? I don't mind doing that. I'm officially in office until December 4th. So
A lot of free time.
I know, and then who knows, right? But putting this together so that you can use it as a template or just an outline going forward for whatever the board looks like, and for your public hearing. Does that make sense? Okay, I will do that.
I'd like to add, I think that we should consider asking this new commission, the new board, to lengthen this time out, because I don't see where we're going to come up with a consensus between us, in the next, one more meeting or two more meetings.
I agree.
I think it's going to take, this
Yeah.
is, and I can't see rushing to judgment, without having it extremely well
Right.
vetted. So,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we can't get something basic like Greg is proposing, at least
Right.
permitting and registration, but
Yeah.
But it's really where we go from there. That that's going to generate some money. It's going to generate some fees and make
Right.
people know who they are. But really, where are we going with this, after that. So I think it's going to be very difficult to do that by January 17th or whatever.
Yeah,
we're supposed to be
that's
doing.
a very flexible date.
So-
You can definitely approach Board of Selectmen on that. But I do think this was our first foray into, into goal setting and getting into, and I think if you watch that webinar too, that'll probably put some more ideas into your heads. Okay, so we'll do that. So I'd say in number 6, which is we're finally at number 6, folks, schedule future meetings. I would say hold off on 6A, which is that public hearing for now, till you meet again. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, and then,
That's why you're in charge, Ann.
right. And then the regular meeting, the next regular meeting, you all can think about a good time. I mean, obviously holidays are coming and.
So the meeting on December 4th is not happening?
Yeah, and it never, I mean, it was a suggested time, and then as it turned out, it was not a good day anyway, for a lot of reasons. So,
The 11th?
but it is now the 20th of November, so, I mean, you could meet, you could even meet on December 11th or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I
Like,
think that's,
that gives you,
The 11th
so
of
you
that
don't
week
lose the,
sometime.
Right.
your little impetus that you've had here and decision making you've done here, and you can start building on this. So this could be a good, so that could be a good date. I'll just write that in here.
11th?
The 11th of December, which is, which is a Monday.
All right.
Okay, so
Sounds
that's
good.
good. So that's 6B. Okay, so let me just look back at my notes. I don't think I have much in item 7, which is the report of the co-chairs. I think I may have had one little thing here. There is going to be so there's a Connecticut Conference of Municipalities yearly convention. I'm not sure if I'm going to it or not. But there is going to be a presentation on short-term rentals. And so as a member town, and if you're an official, you can, and you have login, and you have an account, so to speak, with CCM, you can watch those webinars. And so it'll be very helpful. That's another pretty key.
When's that gonna be?
So that will be, I think that is coming up on the 28th.
November?
Of November. But the thing is, unless you're at the convention, you're not going to hear it then. And I can't remember last year, but there was a little bit of a time between them posting all the webinars. But they're very helpful, because I had gone to one on ARPA, I think, and it was very helpful when I had to do
This
it.
was $300?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you want to attend, I think Ann Thurlow's paying for it.
Yes,
That won't be
But I looked at at the different topics for this year, and that was definitely one of them. I thought it would be good to update or get some info, but that should be available. I think it's certainly going to be available within the time frame that we're working, so that'll be another probably good resource. Most of their speakers are very good. Okay, so that's that's it for me, and my co-chair Gary.
Ready to go.
Ready to go? Okay. Any final comment by anybody?
I'd just like to go on the record as thanking you for your service, and I would personally like to urge the Board of Selectmen to continue having you and Ann
Thank you.
serve, if you would so desire.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
Endorse that.
I second that. Third it.
Okay. Well,
You guys
thank
can't leave now.
We're in the universe of short-term rentals. So. Well, thanks for the kind words, and if I don't see you again, it's always so strange. This would be my last official meeting, so it was really wonderful working with you, and I just feel like I'm getting to know you, and I never usually leave in the middle of anything, so it would be nice.
So So
I'd
you
like to
you
stay
can't leave
on.
now.
I know. So we'll see what happens. But, and no matter what, I will follow. And you might see me at the podium if I respond.
Yeah.
So, but we'll see what happens. But thanks. Okay. So,
Can I ask one?
yes.
Is it possible that, and maybe Mark knows this question, but how does, and you know, and maybe Paul knows, because Paul was at the state level.
Yes.
Where's the Airbnbs now charge a sales tax that Paul informed us of?
Right.
How do they define the difference between, you know, a weekly rental, you know, a gentleman renting his house out for a week at the beach, or, you know, or you know, where's that crossover between that becomes for sales tax purposes?
They all are. It doesn't have to go through Airbnb if you're renting your house.
I'd have to look that up.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that is the,
Would you mind doing that?
yeah,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Because that is the one thing from the state level that we have, you know. And when you read the article from the COG, the updated piece there, that's mentioned that there was a lot of attempt to deal with short-term rentals at the state level.
Right.
And then that just all fell through. So this is why we exist, you know.
Right.
So maybe that'll change. But for now, we're sort of stuck with it. Yeah. Okay. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay.
Second.
Okay. All those in favor?
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your patience. Okay.